Hi everyone and welcome to my DDR4 overclocking guide. So today I'm going to show you the steps that you can go through to try and take a 3600 megahertz memory kit up to 4400 megahertz with a few hours and a little bit of testing and some benchmarking. Now I've used the Thermaltake kit with Hynix C die, but you can use this as a rough guide for any memory kit that you have at home. With this, you can use my settings as a like a baseline if you're doing something very similar, but you can take this as a rough guide for the sort of thing that you need to do for any memory kit. It could be trying to take your 3200 megahertz kit up to 36, or maybe you're lucky enough to have a 4000 megahertz kit and you want to bump it up a little bit further. So not only is it's not necessarily just about this memory kit, we can use this as a guide and as a reference tool for any of the memory kits that you guys have at home. One of the things I will say right from the very beginning is when I show you the XMP, if you're on an AMD system, then that could be called DOCP. This should be something everyone at home should make sure is enabled, because it makes sure that your memory is actually running at its rated speed. Because if that's not enabled, it could actually be sat there running at 2133 megahertz. If you like this video though, please like, comment, share, make sure you're subscribed, hit the bell, all of those horrible things that we feel like we have to say in every video, but I always forget. Anyway, let's move on and get familiar with the BIOS. A strange place to start, but it is going to be where we are going to need to start, and that is going to be in the BIOS. So what you do, press the power button on your system from a hard shutdown, and then you wait till the lights come on your keyboard, and you can press either delete or F2. Now I've got my Elgato set up as well to capture. Once you're in the BIOS, a lot of people get kind of daunted by this, but if you are a little bit scared, then just stay away from some of the deeper menus and stick to some of the simplistic ones, and I'll talk you through a few of those now. So really easy one, AI overclock tuner. This one here, you can hit that to XMP and it will turn your memory on to the speeds that it's meant to be running at, the listed speeds that are on the packet when you buy it. As long as your CPU can support that speed, then it will run fine. If you're running some very incredibly high speed memory, sometimes you need a little bit of manual intervention. But the only other things that we're going to really talk about today are going to be a little bit further down in here, in DRAM timing control. Now you can see that the memory timings have been set here, but the command rate has been left on auto. It will normally, when it's on XMP, that will normally be set to 2. There is a lot of discussion for the command rate to be 1, but we can talk about that later on. And then the other thing that we will be tweaking here, stroke later on, it's going to be the DRAM voltage. It's actually set to 1.2 because of the XMP, but we're gonna fiddle around with this a little bit. Sorry, it will be 1.35 because we've just set XMP, but it was on 1.2 before when it was on auto. So when you leave the BIOS, you hit F10, and now F10 is to save. Now these are the settings that we've changed so far. So we've enabled the XMP settings, and then the settings underneath are what XMP has enabled, and that gives us our baseline for what we're going to do in a little bit. So we're doing that, we're going to hit save and then go back to the desktop. So first and foremost, when you've made changes in the BIOS, first thing to do is check for stability. Now we have a lot of options here, but I'm going to go for large FFTs because you can see it stresses memory, controller and RAM, and that's obviously what we are changing in the BIOS. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to disable AVX, and that's just because of the crazy amount of extra heat it adds because it enables a completely separate part of the CPU. But anyway, what we'd also want to do That's Prime 95. That's free. You can find that easily online. I'll put the link underneath. Hardware monitor is another tool that I use a lot, and this again is free. It gives you a lot of options, but one of the things that we are really interested in reality here is the memory timings, the memory temperatures, and then CPU-Z. I think personally everyone should have CPU-Z on their system, and we can see what's going on with our CPU. But if we open another one, we can put it by the side and it will tell us our memory settings as well. So this is just so each time we've made a change, we can come in, double check, make sure everything's okay, and then we can just hit OK on Prime 95 and let that run. I would set a little timer for half an hour, see how you get on. We're not going to do that here today because we're going to save time. The other benchmarks that I am going to be running is IDA. You can get a free version of this, and this is a really good benchmark for seeing synthetic memory differences. You can see that we do read, write and copy on the memory here. Going to do some Cinebench. I'm also going to do some Far Cry 5, and I'm also going to do some Shadow of the Tomb Raider, using those two games because they do respond well to the AMD caching. So these are two of the games that I'm hoping that the memory changes will see a difference in. The main program that we're going to see differences in is going to be IDA, though this will give you a very easily noticeable difference when we make changes, and you'll be able to see how the changes make the scores go up, and if you go too far, if the scores go down, because that's something that you do need to consider. You can overclock too far and make things worse. So that is another thing to keep an eye out for. Now we're going to go back to the BIOS and make our first change for an overclock. So really easy way when you are overclocking the memory, because that means, for me, it means going beyond what it would have been out of the packet, because that's what it's listed as being designed to do. And you can come down here and find the memory frequency. Now you can see we've got 3600 there. You can literally go down. Now it's got the 3800 grayed out, and it does say underneath that it may grayed out and not recommended because of base clock frequencies and ratios. But to be fair, you could literally just go for 37, 33 if you wanted, but we're going to try for 38, and we're going to leave everything else standard because I do want to go through something. Okay, so back to the desktop. First thing I would do is open CPU-Z, like I've said. Check everything looks okay, but the most important thing to do is look over here. Now, where it says DRAM frequency, this does get mentioned a lot, but it only looks like it's running at 1900 megahertz. But DDR stands for double data rate. So what you do is you times this number by 2, and that gives you 3800 megahertz. Now, I know this is completely stable because I have done it already, but for you guys at home, you need to remember the silicon lottery. So you don't know whether your CPU will be able to do this. You don't know whether your memory will be this good. Just because it is the same type that I'm using even, your memory might be better, your memory might be worse. It's always good to run a benchmark test, just so that you know it's stable before moving on and making any other changes. We do this a lot when we make changes down here to the timings as well, because we will do these timings one at a time, which can take a while for us to be able to find stability, but that's just part and parcel of it. You can use my settings as a guideline, but I would desperately encourage you to find your own settings, because you'll be able to find much better ones probably. Or it might be the reason why you can't get your overclock in place, because you might find that your memory kit runs a little bit slower than mine, or maybe even needs a little bit more voltage. But now, this is the first basic one. Now we're going to go and make some changes in the BIOS and see if we can hit 4000 megahertz. Now 4000 megahertz, what we can do is go down to 4000, hit that. For this, I didn't find I needed any extra voltage, but I did need to make some memory changes. Now, I personally found that 18 was okay, but I couldn't get it running unless this one, the RAS timing to CAS delay, was set to 21. Now, what I personally do is I couldn't get it running at 4,000 stable, so I went in, made a change, set it to 19, it didn't work, so then I went to 21. You have to work at it in stages, and it's this bit takes a little bit of time. But I didn't have to change the voltage for this one, but the next one that we do, which I'm going to jump us straight to 4,000 megahertz, you do. Once you've made changes, hit F10. Now back to the desktop. I've set everything up again. So we have our CPU settings here so that we can keep an eye on that. We have the memory over here. You can see 2,000 megahertz on the DRAM frequency, times that by 2, 4,000 megahertz. You can see our timings listed underneath. And the other thing that we need to start keeping an eye on now are these two voltages, VCC-IO and system agent. We have not manually set those, but the system agent specifically, as you turn the memory up, can get turned up automatically by the BIOS. So it might be something that later on we need to turn back down a little bit, or gradually work our way back down to try and help the CPU, because this inherently, as the voltages go up, your temperatures can increase as well. So at this point, what I will do is we are going to run our benchmark. We can see exactly how long it's lasted for. You may get some errors in the body of the text of prime, or if the stopwatch stops running, you know that the system could have crashed as well. That's just a handy hint for something to keep an eye on when you are testing. So after 30 minutes, you can see that everything is all okay. It's passed our benchmarks. You can have a look at the temperatures down here, just so that you can see how hot everything has got. Now, at this point, this would normally be when I would end the bench, and then I would start to think about doing my benchmarks. So with the benchmarks, IDA, for example, or Cinebench, and then I'd run these, write all the little notes down so that we can get an idea on the performance of everything that's happened. And I will show you all of this data now. So the next stage after that was 4,400 megahertz, which meant I needed to bump the voltage. Well, it was 4,200 megahertz. It meant I needed to bump the voltage up to 1.4 volts for the memory. 4,400 megahertz was also 1.4 volts. I'll show you the settings in a sec, so you can use this as a research tool for at home. I did try to get 4,600 megahertz, but even with loads of volts, my kit was just not playing ball. Not to the point where I thought it was risk going any further, but something else that I did. So I'll show you, this is the 3,600 megahertz settings. Now this is the stock left it alone settings as it came out of the box. You'll also see that the command rate at the bottom is 2T. When you move up to 4,000, this was at 1.35 volts. I changed the 21 setting in there for the RAS to CAS and the RAS pre-charge times, and that gave us 4,000 megahertz. Then up to 4.2 or 4,200 megahertz, however you would like to put it. This went up to 1.4 volts, and I changed the 21 in the middle, as you can see there again. Then when we move up to 4.4, still at 1.4 volts, but we've had to make an extra change here. So the RAS and CAS, well, the 23s have been changed, and also down the bottom I've slackened the cycle time off to 42. But then what I also did is I went hunting for low timings. So it went back to 3,600 megahertz, and I was trying to bring all the timings down. Now at this point, I went and manually changed the the command rate to 1T and fixed it there. If you have a look at all of the others that I've just shown you, they were all at 1T. And that was something that as soon as I started making changes in the board did that itself. But it will give you an idea that you should be able to do that at home. Something that I did find quite strange though with this kit is I did just try to go to 1T on with it at 3,600 megahertz. So XMP 1T, that was the only thing that I was going to change. I had actually a fair bit of trouble trying to get it working, which I found quite strange. But for whatever reason, maybe it's something too tied into the XMP. But these are quirks with tech. My settings here may not work for you at home. You may need to have a little fiddle, but that's why I've said to you about going back into the desktop, running some benchmarks, and then having a look at the numbers that you get. But anyway, with 3.6 or 3600 megahertz. To bring the timings down, 1T, and then it was 14, 19, 19, 28 I managed to bring the timings down to, but it did need 1.65 volts through the memory to be able to do it, and that was the best I personally managed to do. Now, with the results that I said to you about, that I would show you, IDA, really with IDA is all about the memory bandwidth. So we haven't got the low CAS here because it doesn't really make a lot of difference on the 3600 megahertz. But you can see that it went fairly healthily upwards. 4000 and 4.2 kind of traded places a few times, which was kind of strange. Could have something to do with the uncore frequency. I didn't want to get too deep in with this video. I wanted to try and keep it kind of light so that we can just, you know, learn progressively rather than chucking you all in on the deep end. I know this might not be to everyone's tastes, but I thought it would be a good place for us to start. One of the things I will say though, then I moved on to other benchmarks like Blender, for example. And again, it kind of played silly buggers where some of the results did better than others. And like, for argument's sake, the 4200 was one of the worst ones. If you have a look at the scores, like the timings between them, especially the 1080p, are very small. But technically the quickest was 4000. Now the reason why I'm highlighting the fact that different benchmarks respond in different ways is this is something that you're going to need to think about at home. What is the benchmark that you are going to want to focus on? Because if you do something like Vegas or Blender, then you may be doing something different to if you were gaming, for example, which I will bring up now. And this is the one for both of you at home to kind of think about, because it's about the gaming. And in reality, the low CAS timings did better than the immense amounts of bandwidth. Obviously, with a really high-end kit with like 4600 megahertz or something like that, are you necessarily, the games just aren't utilising that. But the differences between them, in reality, is incredibly slight. So with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 4K being at 82 average, but then the 1440p was 143, that did actually mean that it was 3 frames per second average over the 38, for example. So there's a lot of data there for you to kind of embrace. So here is my tips and tricks for me to send you away with. If it was me, I would be looking for a good quality memory kit with decent tight timings out of the box to start with. Because it's going to mean that you're going to get good silicon. It's going to give you a heads up for you to then be able to tweak and play with beyond that point. As far as heat is concerned, most memory kits aren't going to suffer too wildly with an overvolt. You do just need to make sure that you've got a decent case and you've not got any like retarded amounts of heat being introduced. We did do GPU based tests with this, and the GPU was right below the memory sticks, and it didn't do any great shakes for us in hours. But you're just going to need to make sure that, like I said, you have got a decent kit. We did use thermal take today, but that was just because I wanted to start with something that I didn't necessarily have already in, and these were the results that we managed to get, and they were Samsung B dies as well. So there's a good guide. The thing is, I've had to try and make this really quick and tidy and light, but I could go into it so much more. To make a change, test. Make a change, test. That's the best way that I can suggest. Use my settings as a rough guide, but the thing that I do have to stress is please, please always try to better my results, because that's what you need to do. Spend a little bit of extra time tweaking and playing around with it to see how you can get it. But make sure you keep doing those benchmarks, because you can get to a point where you make a change and the benchmarks can drop, and then you know you've done something wrong and you need to go back to the drawing board. Have yourself a little notepad and pen to the side of you so that you can keep some rough notes so that you know what's going on, and then if anything untoward happens, you know that the last thing that you changed needs to go back and be tweaked again. It may need more voltage, may need to be slackened off a little bit. You're just going to have to play around with it. But that was how I got a 3600 megahertz kit to run at 4.4 randomly with the command rate at 1. But then we also and tightened the timings at 3600 megahertz and got the timings down quite a bit tighter. And for the most part, that was where the performance lied. But for now at least, this has been the tiniest one with another video for you. Out. Love you, sis.